The crack of the whip was a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the Arizona desert. Dust, the color of rust and blood, billowed from the wagon wheels, coating everything Carolyn Turner owned in a fine, gritty film. She could feel it in her teeth, a constant reminder of how far she was from the rain-washed cobblestones of Boston. The air itself was a physical weight, thick with heat that shimmered above the cracked earth and distorted the distant mesas into wavering specters. The wagon lurched to a sudden, violent stop. The jolt sent Caroline sliding on the wooden bench, her hand flying out to brace herself against the canvas siding. Ahead, the lead wagon had halted at an unnatural angle, its driver frozen in place. Her father, Edward Turner, was instantly alert. The soft, pensive lines of his face, so often lost in dreams of empire and cattle, hardened into the sharp angles of a man who knew the language of violence. "What is it?" Caroline asked, her voice a dry whisper. Edward didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the pass ahead, a narrow cut between two towering rock formations. From the shadows of those rocks, 5 riders emerged, not with the whooping cries of a raiding party, but with a silent, methodical purpose that was far more terrifying. They were not Apache. Their faces, though grimy with dust, were starkly white beneath the brims of their battered hats. They carried rifles with a casual familiarity, their movements economical and predatory. "Bandits," Edward hissed, reaching beneath the seat for the Winchester rifle he kept there. "Caroline, get down. Stay low." But she couldn't. She was paralyzed, her eyes drawn to the man who led them. He rode a powerful black horse that seemed to absorb the blistering sunlight. He was taller than the others, his face a brutal landscape of sharp cheekbones and a jawline that looked hewn from granite. A deep scar, a pale white crescent, cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanent look of cynical appraisal. He moved with an unnerving confidence, as if this dusty, dangerous road belonged to him. The lead bandit raised a hand, and his men fanned out their rifles, aimed not at the drivers, but at the oxen, a clear and chilling threat. There would be no escape. "We don't want trouble," the lead wagon master shouted, his voice tight with fear. "Take the supplies you need. Just let us pass." The scarred man ignored him, his gaze sweeping over the small convoy until it settled on the Turner's wagon. He nudged his horse forward, the animal's hooves crunching on the gravel. He stopped just feet away, his eyes the color of faded denim, passing over Edward with casual dismissal before locking onto Caroline. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his lips. "Well now," he drawled, his voice a low rumble, "what have we here? A desert rose far from her garden." He dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. As he approached the wagon, Caroline felt a primal urge to shrink away, to disappear into the shadows of the canvas. But her mother's voice, a ghost of memory, echoed in her mind. "A Turner meets the world with their chin up always." She held his gaze, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The man's eyes weren't just looking at her. They were cataloging her. The fine quality of her dress, now soiled with travel dust, the delicate structure of her hands, and then they stopped. His focus narrowed on the glint of silver at her throat. It was a locket intricately carved with the image of a songbird, her mother's last gift to her before the sickness took her. It was the last tangible piece of her old life, a connection to a world of grace and love that felt a universe away. "That's a pretty thing," the bandit said, his voice deceptively soft. He reached for it. Instinctively, Caroline recoiled her hand, flying up to cover the locket. "No." She said the word, a small, sharp crack in the tense air. The man's smile vanished. Before she could react, his hand shot out, his calloused fingers grabbing the delicate chain. He yanked. The silver links bit into her skin, and with a sharp snap, the locket was torn from her neck. A thin line of blood welled up where the chain had broken. "That doesn't belong to you," Edward roared, lunging from his seat, the Winchester half raised. He never had a chance to aim. Another bandit, moving with startling speed, slammed the butt of his pistol into the side of Edward's head. The sound was a sickening wet thud. Edward collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, slumping unconscious against a stack of crates, blood matting his graying hair. Father Caroline screamed, scrambling toward him. The scarred man blocked her path, dangling the locket from his fingers. The silver songbird swung back and forth, a tiny pendulum marking the end of her world. "A lesson, little Rose," he said, his cold eyes boring into hers. "Everything in this territory belongs to the man strong enough to take it. And you do well to remember the name of the man who taught you that lesson. The name is Godric." He turned, not even glancing at the other wagons. His men hadn't taken a single bag of flour or a barrel of water. They had come for this, for her locket. Why, as he remounted his horse, Caroline overheard him speak to one of his men in a low, curt tone. Just as the old man described. "Now we know they're here. Let's ride." They wheeled their horses around and disappeared back into the rocky pass as silently as they had come, leaving behind a shattered silence, a bleeding man, and a young woman whose life had just been irrevocably fractured. The blood-red dust stirred by their departure began to settle, dusting the wagon canvas like a funeral shroud. The metallic scent of gunpowder and the coppery tang of her father's blood hung heavy in the still hot air. For a long moment, no one moved. The other families were frozen in shock, and their faces pale masks of terror. The harsh reality of the frontier had just been brutally unveiled, not as a struggle against the elements or a conflict with the native people defending their land, but as something far more sinister, a targeted personal violation. Caroline's shock shattered, replaced by a surge of cold, clear purpose. She ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat and pressed it against her father's head, wound her movements deft and sure. The wound was deep, bleeding profusely, but his breathing was steady. He was alive. "He needs a doctor," she said, her voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the stunned silence. "Wagon master, how far to the nearest settlement?" The man, shaken, blinked at her. "Tucson's 2 days, miss. But your ranch, it's just a few hours from here." "Then that's where we're going. We'll get him there and send a rider." She worked quickly her Boston finishing school education, which had included lessons in basic nursing, surfacing from beneath the layers of fear. She cleaned the wound as best she could with water from their canteen and bound his head tightly. As she tended to him, the name the bandit had spoken echoed in her mind. Godric. It meant nothing to her, yet it had been spoken with such significance. And the locket. Why the locket? It had sentimental value, but it was not priceless. It was a specific, deliberate theft, not a crime of opportunity. When her father finally stirred, his eyes fluttering open, his first word was her name. "Caroline." "I'm here, Father," she said, her voice softening. "You're going to be all right." He struggled to sit up, his hand going to his bandaged head. "The bandits. The locket. They're gone. They took it." She saw the shame and fury warring in his eyes. "Just a robbery." He mumbled, his gaze refusing to meet hers. "A common road robbery. We were lucky they didn't take more." "It wasn't a common robbery," Caroline insisted, her voice low but firm. "They knew who we were. The leader, he called himself Godric. He said you would know the name." A flicker of something fear recognition passed through Edward's eyes, so quickly she almost missed it. He immediately masked it with a scowl. "Nonsense. Just a braggart. We will not speak of this again. We have a ranch to build, a new life to start. We will not be deterred by common thugs." "We can't just let them get away with it," she protested. "We have to report this. That man Godric, I saw his face. I would know him anywhere." "No." The sharpness of his tone startled her. "You will do nothing. You will forget his name. Forget his face. We will post guards at the ranch. We will be more careful. This is the price of life in the territory. You must accept it." His fear was a tangible thing, a foul taste in the air between them. It was more than the caution of a man who had just been attacked. It was the terror of a man who knew his attacker. The conflict was drawn as clearly as a line in the sand, her burning need for justice, for the return of the last piece of her mother, and her father's desperate, inexplicable insistence on inaction. As the wagon train slowly began to move again, creaking toward the promise of their new home, Caroline pressed her fingers to the raw skin on her neck. She would not forget. She couldn't. The empty space where the locket used to rest was a hollow ache in her soul, a debt that she would one day see paid. This was not just an inciting incident. It was a declaration of war. The Turner Ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, a patch of defiant green carved out of the ochre and umber landscape. A creek fringed with cottonwoods snaked through the property, a lifeline in the arid terrain. In the weeks that followed the attack, the skeletal frame of the ranch house fleshed out with timber and adobe, and the rhythm of hard work became a fragile shield against the memory of the violence. But for Caroline, the shield was porous. Every sunset that painted the sky the color of dried blood brought back the image of her father falling. Every glint of light on a metal tool reminded her of the silver locket swinging from Godric's hand. Her first and most formidable obstacle was her own father. Edward threw himself into the ranch's creation with a frantic energy his days consumed with cattle, and fences his evenings with ledgers and plans. He refused to speak of the attack, treating any mention of it as a personal affront. "The past is a closed book," Caroline, he told her one evening, his voice clipped and sharp as he reviewed a bill of lading. "Our focus must be on the future, on making this venture a success. How can we build a future on a foundation of fear?" She countered her own voice, quiet but unyielding. She had inherited her mother's gentle demeanor, but her father's stubborn will. "That man is still out there. He knew us, Father. He knew what he was looking for. Don't you want to know why?" "What I want," Edward said finally, looking up from his papers, his eyes shadowed with a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion, "is to protect my only child. I brought you to this harsh land, and I will not see you put in any more danger by chasing ghosts. The matter is closed." His tone was final, the cold shutting of a heavy door. Their conversations became a careful dance around this central unspoken conflict, a chasm of silence widening between them. Defied, but not defeated, Caroline sought answers in the only place she could, the land itself. She began taking long rides along the creek, ostensibly to gather herbs and sketch the local flora, a habit from her Boston life that now served as a convenient cover. It was on one of these rides in a secluded grove where the cottonwoods grew thick and the water ran deep and cool that she encountered him. He was not a phantom emerging from the brush, but a still silent presence that seemed to have been there all along. One moment she was dismounting to examine a cluster of purple flowers. The next, he was there standing by the water's edge watching her. He was Apache, that much was clear from his buckskin leggings and the intricate beadwork on his moccasins. His black hair was held back by a simple leather band, and his face, proud and angular, was devoid of war paint. It was the intensity of his gaze that held her dark and intelligent. Neither hostile nor welcoming, merely observant. Caroline's hand instinctively went to the small pistol her father had insisted she carry, but she made no move to draw it. There was no menace in his posture. "You are a long way from your fortress," he said. His English was flawless, yet formal, each word chosen with a deliberation that suggested a learned rather than a native tongue. "I'm on my father's land," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. A faint, ironic smile touched his lips. "My people have a different map." He gestured to the landscape around them. "This is the land of the Chiricahua. Your fences are new, the rocks are old." He took a step closer, and she saw he was young, perhaps only a few years her senior. "The men who stopped your wagon, they were not my people." The statement was so direct, so unexpected, that it caught her off guard. "How did you know about that?" "The desert has many eyes, and it remembers the sound of white men's guns," he said. "They follow the vulture's path, leaving only rot behind. They are led by a man you call Godric." Caroline's breath hitched. "You know him?" "Every Apache knows the name of the serpent who steals eggs from the nest and blames the coyote." The cryptic words hung in the air, a piece of a puzzle she was desperate to solve. He was offering her a key, but his motives were unclear. "Who are you?" she asked. "I am Naicha," he said simply, "son of Cochise." The name meant little to her, but the pride with which he spoke it was unmistakable. He was the son of a chief. "Why are you telling me this?" Naiche's gaze swept over her, taking in the fine lines of her face, the determination in her eyes. "Because you do not look at this land with the same hunger as the others. You look with questions. And because the serpent who bit you is the same serpent who poisons my people's wells." He turned to leave his movement as fluid and silent as a shadow. "Wait," Caroline called out. "Can you help me?" He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Help you do what make war on a man your own father fears?" The question was a sharp, accurate barb. "Be careful, Boston woman. The answers you seek are guarded by truths you may not be prepared to face." With that, he was gone, melting back into the landscape as if he had never been there. Caroline stood alone by the creek, the silence of the grove pressing in on her. Naiche's words had both frightened and invigorated her. He had confirmed her suspicions and given a name to the evil she faced, but he had also warned her of a deeper complexity. Her father's fear wasn't simple caution. It was specific to Godric. The attacks weren't random. They were part of a calculated deception. And her personal quest for a stolen locket was somehow intertwined with the fate of Naiche's people. The first obstacle, her father's silence, had been circumnavigated. Now a new, more dangerous path had opened before her. Caroline's clandestine meetings with Naiche became her lifeline to the truth. Under the guise of her botanical studies, she would ride to the cottonwood grove where he would be waiting. He was a patient teacher, revealing the desert's secrets, the plants that healed the tracks that told stories, the subtle shifts in the wind that heralded a storm. In turn, she spoke of her world of books and cities, and an ocean he had never seen. A fragile trust grew between them, born of shared intelligence and a mutual enemy. From Naiche, she learned the full scope of Godric's malevolence. He was a land baron of insatiable appetite, using a private army of ruthless men to expand his empire. His strategy was diabolical in its simplicity. His men dress as prospectors or traders, Naiche explained one afternoon, his voice low with controlled anger. They attack a small homestead or a supply wagon. They take what they want, and then they leave behind a single Apache arrow or a moccasin. The soldiers come, they see the evidence, and they retaliate against the nearest peaceful camp. They call us hostiles, and it gives Godric the excuse he needs to claim the abandoned land. "It's monstrous," Caroline breathed, the cold-blooded cynicism of the plan sickening her. "It is the way of the world he is building," Naiche said. a world with no room for my people. Driven by this new knowledge, Caroline began her own quiet investigation. She started paying closer attention to the conversations among the ranch hands, to the gossip from the nearby town of Silver Creek. The name Godric was spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence. He was the most powerful man in the territory, a pillar of the community, who had personally funded the construction of the town's first church. This public benevolence was a chilling counterpoint to the brutal reality Nietzsche had described. Her first real break came during a supply run to Silver Creek. While waiting for her father to conclude his business, she wandered into the general store. In a dusty corner stacked among the barrels of nails and sacks of flour, she saw a wooden crate its side branded with the distinctive G monogram of Godric's ranch. But stenciled beneath it were the initials E.T., Edward Turner. It was one of the crates that had been on their supply wagons when they had reported as lost in the Apache raid. She felt a jolt, a cold shock of confirmation. Godric's men hadn't just been passing through. They had taken their stolen goods directly to their boss's supply chain. Her investigation was interrupted by the man himself. A few weeks later, Jeremiah Godric paid a visit to the Turner Ranch. He arrived unannounced, riding his powerful black stallion flanked by two of his men. He was dressed not as a ruffian, but as a gentleman rancher in a tailored coat and clean leather boots. The scar above his eye was the only hint of the predator beneath the polished veneer. Turner, he greeted her father swinging down from his horse with an easy smile. "Just paying a neighborly call. Heard you were getting settled in." Edward's face went pale. He stood stiffly on the porch, his body language a study in suppressed terror. "Godric, this is unexpected. I do so enjoy the unexpected." Godric set his gaze sliding past Edward to find Caroline, who stood half hidden in the doorway. His smile widened, a cold, predatory gleam entering his eyes. "And this must be your lovely daughter. We had the great misfortune of not being properly introduced." The audacity of the lie, the sheer gall of his presence stole her breath. This was the man who had ripped her mother's locket from her neck, who had left her father bleeding in the dust. And here he was, extending a hand, as if they were old friends. Caroline Edward said, his voice strained, "This is Mr. Godric. He owns the ranch to the north of us." Caroline ignored the outstretched hand. "We've met," she said, her voice like ice. Godric's smile didn't falter. He let his hand drop. "A woman of spirit, I admire that." His eyes swept over their ranch, the half-finished barn, the modest herd in the corral. "It's a hard life starting new. Requires a great deal of capital, a great deal of protection. The Apache have been especially bold this season." The veiled threat was unmistakable. He was reminding her father of his vulnerability, of the power he wielded. Edward visibly flinched. The visit was short, a masterclass in intimidation disguised as pleasantry. When Godric left, Edward sagged against a porch column, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow. "Father," Caroline began, her voice shaking with outrage. "That was him. That was the man from the road. Why didn't you say anything? Why did you let him stand on our porch and threaten us?" "You don't understand," Edward whispered, his face ashen. "You don't understand anything." The final piece of the rising action fell into place a week later, with devastating force. Nietzsche was late for their meeting at the Grove. Hours passed, and a knot of dread tightened in Caroline's stomach. Just as the sun began to set, he appeared not with his usual quiet grace, but on a horse lathered with sweat, his face a mask of grief and fury. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to his side. "My camp," he said, his voice raw. "They came at dawn. Not bandits this time, men dressed as soldiers. But they were his men. I recognized one of them from the day they stopped your wagon." He slid from his horse, his body swaying with exhaustion. They burned our lodges. They scattered our people. They killed my father. The words struck Caroline with the force of a physical blow. She reached out her hand, resting on his arm, offering the only comfort she could. In that moment, their separate quests for justice merged into one. This was no longer just about a stolen locket or a campaign of land fraud. It was about avenging the murder of a chief, about fighting for the very survival of a people. The stakes had been raised to an unbearable height, and Caroline knew with chilling certainty that the path ahead would lead to a confrontation from which not all of them would walk away. That night, Caroline waited until the house was dark and silent. She lit a single lamp in the parlor and laid the evidence on the polished mahogany table. Her mother had prized a detailed sketch of the branded crate she had seen in Silver Creek, and a list of dates and incidents. Naicha had recounted a damning chronicle of Godric's phantom Apache raids. When her father entered, drawn by the light, he stopped short, his face draining of color as he saw what lay on the table. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, but his voice lacked its usual force. It was the bluster of a man already defeated. "The meaning," Caroline said, her voice steady and low, "is that the lies to stop tonight. I know what Godric is doing. I know he stages raids and blames the Apache. I know his men attacked your wagon train, and I know you are terrified of him. I need you to tell me why." Edward stared at the papers, his shoulders slumping. He looked like an old man, and the ambitious fire in his eyes extinguished, replaced by the dull embers of despair. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "You should have left it alone," he whispered. "I told you to leave it alone." "Naiche's father is dead," she said, the words sharp and clean as broken glass. "Godric's men disguised as soldiers murdered him in his own lodge. This is not a ghost I am chasing, Father. This is a monster, and he has you in his grip. Tell me why." For a long time, he was silent. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second a hammer blow against the fragile quiet. When he finally looked up, his face was a portrait of utter desolation, streaked with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. "Because there is no Turner Ranch," he said, his voice cracking. "Not really. This house, this land, the cattle, the very clothes on our backs. It all belongs to him. Jeremiah Godric owns us." The confession landed with the force of a physical blow. Caroline felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "What are you talking about?" "After your mother died," he began, his voice a ragged whisper, "I was lost. The business in Boston was failing. I had debts I couldn't hide anymore. I saw the West as a chance to start over, to build something for you, a legacy. But I had no money. No one would back me." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "And then I met Jeremiah Godric. He was in Boston on business. He was charming, persuasive. He spoke of the Arizona Territory as a land of limitless opportunity. He offered to finance the entire venture. He paid off my debts, bought the land, the supplies, the stock. He made my dream possible." "He loaned you the money?" Caroline asked, trying to grasp the scale of the disaster. "It wasn't a loan," Edward corrected, his voice hollow. "It was an investment in me, in my future, in you." He couldn't meet her eyes. "There were conditions, of course. I signed papers I barely read. I was desperate. I see now they were a contract of servitude." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her father's fear, his refusal to act, his desperate attempts to placate the man who held his leash. It wasn't cowardice. It was the terror of an indentured man. But what does he want? She pressed a cold dread coiling in her stomach. "He's a rich man. He doesn't need our small ranch. Edward finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and what she saw there broke her heart. It was the deepest shame a man could feel. He doesn't want the ranch, Caroline. He told me that from the very beginning. The land, the cattle, they are merely the dowry. The price of his investment, the final payment on my debt, is your hand in marriage. The world dissolved into a roaring in her ears. The parlor, with its familiar furniture and scent of lemon oil, suddenly felt alien, a gilded cage she had never recognized. This wasn't a fight for justice anymore. It was a fight for her very self against economic enslavement, and the most profound personal betrayal she could imagine. Her father hadn't just been a victim of Godric's schemes. He had been a willing, if desperate, participant. He had sold her future to secure his own. He wants to marry me. She repeated the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. He is a widower, Edward continued the confession, now pouring out of him in a torrent of misery. His first wife died years ago. He wants a new wife, a lady from the East. Someone to give him an air of respectability, to bear him heirs. You were the perfect candidate. Young, educated, from a good family. A family he now controlled completely. And the attack on our wagon, she asked, the final horrifying piece falling into place. The locket. It was a test, Edward admitted, his voice barely a whisper. He wanted to see you to make sure you were suitable. The locket was just a trophy, a way to prove to me that he could take anything he wanted at any time, a reminder of who was in charge. Caroline stood up, her body trembling with a rage so pure and cold it felt like ice in her veins. She looked at her father, this man she had loved and trusted, and saw a stranger. He was not a villain, not like Godric. He was something more pathetic, a weak man who had made a deal with the devil and offered his own daughter as collateral. The conflict had been reframed entirely. She was no longer just an investigator seeking truth. She was property, a commodity to be traded, a prize in a rich man's cruel game, and she would rather die than let him win. Caroline was now a prisoner in all but name. Godric arrived the next day with a wagon and an armed escort, his demeanor one of proprietary concern. Given the recent Apache troubles, he announced to the demoralized ranch hands, I feel it is my duty to bring my fiancée and her father to my ranch where they can be properly protected. The move to Godric's estate was a surreal transition from a rustic outpost to a feudal fortress. The main house was a sprawling adobe hacienda, filled with heavy, dark furniture, Navajo rugs, and the mounted heads of animals staring down from the walls with glass eyes. Caroline was given a luxurious room, a cage gilded with lace curtains and a 4-poster bed. A stern housekeeper named Mrs. Rollins was assigned to be her shadow, her presence a constant, silent reminder of her captive status. Her father, a ghost in this new reality, was relegated to a guest room, spending his days drinking whiskey in Godric's study, a broken man witnessing the final bitter cost of his ambition. Godric's plan was to be carried out with all the trappings of civilized society. A dressmaker was summoned from Tucson. A judge was scheduled to ride out to perform the ceremony in 2 weeks. Caroline was to be transformed from a spirited young woman into Mrs. Jeremiah Godric, mistress of a blood-soaked empire. But as she endured the fittings and the false pleasantries, her mind was a whirlwind of frantic calculation. Escape was her only thought. She observed the routines of the household, the changing of the guards, the delivery of supplies. She learned that a young Mexican servant named Maria, whose eyes held a deep sadness, was responsible for cleaning her room each morning. It was a small detail, but it could be an opportunity. Her second obstacle, more daunting than the walls of the hacienda, was discovering the true extent of Godric's plans. She knew he wanted to eradicate the Apache, but she didn't understand the depth of his obsession. The answer was hidden in his study, a room he kept locked, a sanctum of maps and ledgers. Her chance came during a violent thunderstorm that shook the house to its foundations. Godric and his men were out dealing with a flash flood that threatened a section of their grazing land. Mrs. Rollins was distracted overseeing servants as they placed buckets to catch leaks. Caroline slipped away, using a hairpin she'd secreted away to work the old simple lock on the study door. The room smelled of leather cigar smoke and power. Covering one entire wall was a massive hand-drawn map of the territory. It was far more detailed than any official map she had ever seen. Red pins marked the locations of Godric's phantom raids. Blue pins marked cavalry patrols. But it was a series of black pins that drew her eye, forming a tight circle around a remote, mountainous area labeled simply Canyon of the Ancients. Naicha's people had retreated deep into the mountains. This had to be their sanctuary. On Godric's desk, held down by a heavy stone paperweight, was a geological survey report. Her eyes scanned the technical jargon until she found the key phrases: Nek Umpard, significant silver lode, high-grade ore, access limited by topography and native superstition. The Canyon of the Ancients wasn't just a hideout. It was a treasure chest, and it sat on land considered sacred by Naicha's people. Now she understood. This wasn't just about land or power. It was about a specific immense fortune. He didn't just want to drive the Apache away. He needed to wipe them out completely to gain undisputed access to the silver. The stakes had been raised from the survival of a band to the prevention of a genocide, all for a hidden vein of precious metal. A noise in the hallway sent a jolt of panic through her. She quickly put the report back, her eyes darting around the room for anything else. Tucked into a drawer was a small leather-bound journal, his first wife's diary. Unable to resist, she opened it. The entries were filled with sorrow and fear, describing her husband's growing paranoia and his irrational, violent hatred for the local Apache whom she had tried to befriend. The last entry was chilling. Jeremiah rode out this morning with the men from the Barrow. He said it was for a hunting trip, but his eyes held a fire I have never seen. He spoke of final justice. I fear he means to do something terrible. The date was from years ago. It seemed to confirm his monstrous nature. But the mention of another ranch, the Barrow, was a detail she filed away. As she prepared to leave, a maid entered. It was Maria. The young woman's eyes widened in fear when she saw Caroline. "Senora, you should not be in here if he finds you. He's planning on killing them all," Maria Caroline whispered, urgently gesturing to the map. "The Apache in that canyon. For silver." Maria's face, already etched with a quiet sorrow, crumpled. "My cousin's family," she breathed. "They fled to the Canyon of the Ancients after the soldiers came to their village. The distant threat had just become deeply personal for her as well." "Help me," Caroline pleaded. "I have to get out of here. I have to warn them." Maria looked at the door, her body trembling, torn between terror and conscience. "My brother was killed by Mr. Godric's men 2 years ago," she said, her voice barely audible. "They said he was a cattle rustler. He was just trying to find his lost horse." The decision was made. A quiet, fierce resolve settled in her eyes. "There is a supply wagon that leaves for Silver Creek before dawn every 2 days," Maria whispered. "It passes through the east gate. The guard there, he drinks. I can put something in his coffee to make him sleep deeply. You can hide in the back of the wagon, under the canvas." The plan was simple, desperate, and their only hope. For the next day, Caroline played the part of the docile, defeated bride-to-be, while Maria went about her duties, her face an unreadable mask. They were two women from different worlds, united by a shared enemy. and a desperate fight for the survival of those they loved. Her escape was no longer a solitary flight for freedom. It was the first move in a war for the soul of the territory. The climax was not to be at a wedding, but in the crucible of stone and sky at the mouth of the Canyon of the Ancients. Caroline, guided by Nietzsche's warriors who had found her after her escape had reached the sanctuary. But Godric, his network of spies confirming her destination, was not far behind. He hadn't needed her to lead him there. He had known all along. Her escape had simply set his endgame in motion. He arrived with a force of 20 men, not to lay siege, but to seal a tomb. Caroline saw them from a high lookout, watching as they methodically placed crates of dynamite at the canyon's narrow entrance. The plan was clear trap. Nietzsche's people inside the warriors, the women, the children, the elders, and then starve them out or slaughter them at his leisure. As Godric's men worked, the sky began to turn on them. The brilliant blue bled to a bruised purple-gray. The wind, once a gentle sigh, began to howl through the rock formations, whipping sand and grit into the air. A storm was coming, a proper desert squall, as if the land itself was rising in protest. Nietzsche moved his warriors into position along the canyon rims, their forms nearly invisible against the rock. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. A direct assault would be a suicide mission. "He is using you as bait," Nietzsche said to Caroline, his face grim, as they took cover behind a cluster of boulders. "He knows I will not let him take you. He is trying to draw me into the open." "Then let me go to him," Caroline said, her mind racing. "Let me be the distraction." Before Nietzsche could protest, the first fat drops of rain began to fall sizzling on the hot stone. A fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in a stark, ghostly flash. In that instant, Caroline saw Godric standing apart from his men, staring up at the canyon rim directly at their position. And she knew what she had to do. Ignoring Nietzsche's call, she stood up and walked into the open, her hands raised. "Godric," she shouted, her voice carried on the wind. "Let them go. Your fight is with me." A slow, triumphant smile spread across Godric's face. "My fight," he called back, "is with the savage who stole my life. Send him out, or I will blow the entrance and bury you all." Nietzsche appeared at her side, his hand on her arm. "This is my battle," he said, his voice low and firm. "No," Godric roared, his voice cracking with an emotion Caroline had never heard from him before, pure, unadulterated agony. "This is mine." He stepped forward into the now driving rain, his face a mask of torment. "Your father, Nietzsche. He led the raid on my homestead 10 years ago. He and his warriors. They burned my home. They killed my wife, my son." The revelation struck the clearing with the force of a lightning bolt. This wasn't about silver. It was never about silver. That was a pretense, a means to an end. This was a decade-long vendetta, a festering wound that had poisoned his entire existence. "My wife was wearing a locket," Godric continued, his voice choked with grief. He reached into his coat and pulled out the silver songbird. He held it up, the metal dark in the stormy light. "A silver bird, a gift for our first anniversary." They ripped it from her body as she lay dying. He turned his blazing eyes on Caroline. "That is why I took it from you. To show him I had not forgotten." Nietzsche stared at the locket, then at Godric, his face a mixture of confusion and shock. "My father never led a raid on a white homestead with women and children," he stated, his voice ringing with conviction. "It was not his way." "Liar," Godric screamed, raising his rifle. His men followed suit, their guns aimed at the exposed couple. Nietzsche's warriors on the cliffs above drew their bows, the tips of their arrows glinting in the gloom. The world held its breath, balanced on the knife edge of a massacre. It was then that chaos erupted. One of Godric's men, a grizzled old-timer named Silas, who had been with him for years, suddenly cried out, clutching his chest. He staggered and fell not from an arrow, but from a sudden massive heart attack, his body convulsing on the muddy ground. The distraction was all Nietzsche needed. He shoved Caroline back toward the safety of the rocks as the first arrows flew from the cliffs. The air filled with the crack of rifles and the hum of flying shafts. In the ensuing pandemonium, Caroline scrambled to Silas's side. He was dying, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with a desperate need to confess. "He needs to know," Silas rasped, blood flecking his lips. "Godric, he's got it wrong, all wrong." "What are you talking about?" Caroline shouted over the din of the battle. That day, the raid on his place. Silas coughed, his grip tightening. "It wasn't Apache's. It was us. We were mercenaries then, before we worked for Godric regular. Hired by a rival, a man named Henderson from the Barrow Ranch. He wanted Godric's water rights." The name from the diary clicked in her mind. The Barrow. "Henderson paid us to make it look like an Apache raid." Silas choked out his life, fading with every word. We left the signs. Godric's wife and boy. They weren't supposed to be there. It went wrong." His eyes locked on hers, pleading for absolution. "The locket. I took it. I gave it to Godric, later told him I found it on an Apache we killed. It fueled his hate, made him what he is. You gotta tell him." Silas's head fell back, his grip slackening. He was dead. Caroline stared at him, the earth-shattering confession echoing in her soul. Godric's entire life, his monstrous crusade, his all-consuming quest for revenge, was built on a lie perpetrated by his own men. She looked up at the battle raging around her. Godric was fighting like a man possessed, his face a contortion of grief and hate. Nietzsche was coordinating his warriors, trying to drive the attackers back from the dynamite without suffering heavy losses. Caroline held the key, a truth so powerful it could stop the world. But what would it do? Could she, in the middle of this firefight, make Godric believe her? And what then? Would it stop the violence? Or would the revelation of such a profound betrayal simply shatter him into a more dangerous kind of madness? Or should she stay silent, let Nietzsche have his justice against the man who had murdered his father, and let Godric die with his righteous lie intact? The storm raged, the battle intensified, and Caroline was faced with a moral choice more complex and terrible than life or death. In the heart of the storm, amidst the screams of men and the crack of rifles, Caroline made her choice. She scrambled from Silas's body, the terrible truth, a burning coal in her throat, and ran toward Godric. Arrows and bullets tore through the air around her, but she moved through the chaos as if in a trance. "Godric," she screamed, her voice raw. It was a lie. He turned, his face contorted with rage at her interference. He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him as a shield. "Get back," he roared at Nietzsche's warriors. "Listen to me." Caroline gasped, struggling against his grip. "Silas told me it wasn't the Apache. It was your own men, hired by Henderson from the Barrow Ranch. They made it look like a raid. Your wife, your son. They were killed by the men you trust." For a moment, Godric's crazed eyes just stared at her. The words didn't seem to penetrate the thick wall of his decade-long grief. "Lies," he spat. "Apache tricks." "The locket," she cried, her voice breaking. "Silas took it. He gave it to you to feed your hatred. He confessed it all before he died. Your entire revenge is built on a lie." Something in her desperate sincerity and the sheer world-altering horror of her words finally broke through. Godric's grip loosened. His eyes lost their focus, turning inward, replaying 1,000 memories through this new, terrifying lens. The conviction that had been the bedrock of his soul for 10 years began to crumble, and the entire edifice of his being came crashing down. The rifle slipped from his numb fingers. He stared into the rain-swept distance, a man hollowed out, his past a fraud, and his future a void. The lull in the fighting was broken by the sound of shod horses clattering on the rocks above. A new group of riders appeared on the ridge, not Godric's men, not Apache warriors. They wore the blue coats of the U.S. cavalry, and at their head was a U.S. Marshal, his badge glinting in the storm's gloom. "Jeremiah Godric," the Marshal's voice boomed. "You are under arrest by order of the territorial government." As the soldiers descended, Nietzsche lowered his bow, his warriors fading back into the rocks. He looked at the shattered man standing in the mud, no longer a monster, but a pathetic broken shell. Vengeance felt like ash in his mouth. The Marshal dismounted, his eyes, taking in the scene, the dead, the dynamite, the broken man, and the woman who stood beside him. "We received a rider from the Turner Ranch," he said, looking at Caroline. "A signed confession from your father, Miss Turner, detailing Godric's criminal enterprise, his debts, the forced marriage. Edward Turner did the right thing in the end. A final act of redemption. Her father had found his courage." The soldiers took Godric into custody. He offered no resistance, moving like a man in a dream, his eyes vacant. As they led him away, he looked at Caroline one last time, not with hatred, but with a terrifying, empty bewilderment. Nietzsche walked to her side. The storm was beginning to pass the rain, softening to a drizzle. He looked at the captured Godric, then at the bodies of the men who had fallen. He had avenged his father, but not in the way he had expected. He had won, but the victory was somber. He had chosen to trust Caroline's plea in the heat of battle, and in doing so had opted for a more profound justice over simple vengeance. He had proven himself not just a warrior, but a leader wise enough to recognize a truth that transcended the thirst for blood. The cycle of violence, for now, was broken. With Godric's arrest and Edward Turner's comprehensive testimony, his entire criminal empire unraveled. The investigation exposed years of land fraud, intimidation, and murder, implicating powerful figures across the territory. Henderson of the Barrow Ranch was arrested, and the truth of the raid on Godric's family finally came to light, a sordid tale of greed that had spawned a decade of tragedy. The fraudulent land claims were invalidated, returning property to their rightful owners and opening the way for a more just settlement of the territory. Edward, having faced his own demons, worked tirelessly to rebuild his relationship with Caroline. He sold what remained of his holdings and used the funds to help the families, both white and Apache, who had been victimized by Godric. It was a small penance, but it was a start. Nietzsche now, the recognized leader of his people, stepped out of the shadows of war and into the light of diplomacy. With Godric's political influence destroyed and the truth of his deceptions revealed, the territorial government was forced to reconsider its Apache policies. Nietzsche, articulate and wise, negotiated from a position of strength and moral authority. He did not ask for a return to the past, but for a viable future. The resolution was not a document signed in a dusty office, but a ceremony held in the valley below the Canyon of the Ancients. It was a place that had been slated for a massacre, and was now the site of a historic peace. The Apache gathered not as defeated wards, but as sovereign partners. The honest settlers, including a humbled Edward Turner, came to witness the marking of a new treaty that secured the Apache's ancestral lands in the mountains, guaranteeing their autonomy and protecting their sacred sites. Caroline stood beside Nietzsche as he and the governor put their marks on the document. She watched as her father, his face etched with a painful but cleansing sorrow, shook the hand of the new Apache chief. The air was not filled with triumphant celebration, but with a quiet, solemn sense of hope. The fragile, precious hope that comes after a long and brutal war. The wounds were deep and would take generations to heal, but for the first time, the people of the valley, both new and old, were looking forward instead of back. They were no longer defined solely by their conflicts, but by the possibility of a shared peace. Months later, the land had begun to heal. New grass covered the scars of the battle at the canyon mouth, and the first houses of a new joint settlement were rising in the valley. Caroline and Naisha stood on a quiet ridge overlooking it all, a place where the settlers' new fields met the edge of the Apache's protected lands. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. In her hand, Caroline held the silver locket. The marshal had returned it to her after the trial, a relic of a painful past. For weeks she had kept it tucked away, uncertain of its meaning. It was her last link to her mother, a symbol of the Boston life she had left behind. But it was also a symbol of Godric's obsession of the violence and betrayal that had nearly destroyed them all. It was heavy with ghosts. Naiche watched her, his expression serene. He didn't speak, knowing this was a choice she had to make alone. She looked at the locket, the little silver songbird frozen in mid-flight. Her mother had given it to her as a symbol of freedom and beauty. But her own freedom, she now realized, wasn't found in clinging to the past, but in letting it go to make room for the future. With a quiet sense of purpose, she knelt at the base of a newly planted sapling, a young cottonwood that stood exactly on the border between the two lands. She dug a small hole in the soft earth with her fingers. She held the locket for a moment longer, whispered a silent goodbye to the girl she had been, and then placed it in the ground. As she covered it with soil, she was not burying a memory, but planting a new one. She was letting go of her old roots to allow new ones to grow deep and strong in this new ground that belonged to both worlds. The tree would grow its roots, drawing strength from her mother's token, its branches offering shade to future generations of both Apache and settler children. It would be a living testament to their shared future. She stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer Caroline Turner of Boston, a reluctant pioneer. She was a woman of this land, a bridge between two peoples, her identity forged in fire and love. Naiche took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the valley, their home. Then, without a word, they turned and started walking back toward the light of their house together.